Hi, everyone. This is Mackenzie Rockcliffe from the American Tree Farm System. Thank you for joining us. This is the last of our non-timber forest products webinar series, but it's been a great series. We've seen all sorts of new speakers and new participants from outside the Tree Farm Network, but I just want to say a quick thank you to the people that helped us put this together. Thank you to the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, the USDA National Agroforestry Center, the USDA Forest Service, and especially the Extension Forest Farming Community of Practice, which is where pretty much exclusively all the wonderful speakers we've heard from in this series have come from. And this is the last in the series, and so I hope you guys have all enjoyed it. If you'd like to see the past webinars, I'll put the link into the chat box so that you can look at what we've been doing. And there are CFE credits for this webinar. The video will be available for a month to watch for credit, and you'll receive the slides, a couple articles that he's going to mention, and the certificate after this webinar. And then if you watch it later, you'll receive it in an email in a month. So, and if you ever have any problems hearing during the webinar, if your internet is off and so you're having trouble, first I would suggest refreshing your browser. That often helps. And then another thing that you can do is if it's just a lost cause and you're just having trouble, you will be sent the recording. So worst comes to worst, you will get this content. It just might not be live. And so we'll get us started with Production of Forest Botanicals for Market by Eric Burkhart. And actually you can just take it away, Eric.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you from central Pennsylvania on what is a cold and blustery day here. Glad you could join me. Today I want to talk a little bit in about an hour that we have on the production of forest botanicals for market, and here we're specifically talking about commercially oriented production. And I'm going to speak about some of my own work, some of which I'll briefly just cite the papers that some of these analysis, research results are drawn from for your further consideration, whether you agree or not with what I'm saying, or you want to dig more into the facts or the analysis. So in that regard, I've asked Mackenzie to follow up this presentation with an email that's going to have the papers attached to it. So you're welcome to review those, and my email is in there as well, and you'll be able to get in touch with me directly and talk to me about anything that you might have heard or you find confusing or you want to disagree with or share some insights into. I'll say that I'm not an expert per se. I'm just someone that's been engaged in this particular industry for about 15 years now, and fortunate enough to meet a variety of different people coming from a lot of different areas of the eastern U.S. As I look out at everybody that's tuning in here, I'm pleased to see that we've got a lot of people from the eastern U.S., but we also have some folks from the western U.S. as well. So this will be geared towards botanicals from the eastern U.S., but I think a lot of what I'm going to share is applicable not only to the United States as a whole, but throughout the whole herbal supply chain. A lot of these issues I've chosen to highlight, and that's what I'm going to do here in this presentation, is use some case studies to highlight some of the issues that come up with production of these forest botanicals. It's applicable not only in the United States, but also throughout the world. And so with that, I'm coming to you from Shavers Creek Environmental Center, Penn State University, and I'm going to be talking about 3 plants today in specific. I've chosen to go deep into 3 plants rather than to stay shallow and try and cover a variety of different botanicals. And so what I'm going to ask is that people reserve their questions until the end. We will wrap up at approximately 3 o'clock, and I'll be glad to then look at the questions that are coming through and take a stab at answering whatever I can in the time that we'll have allotted. We won't stick around until 5 o'clock or something like that, but we'll take some time and take those questions at the end. As I said, my contact information will be in a follow-up email, in those papers, and I welcome communication from anybody that might be listening in and might have some either questions or some experiences to share. So I'm not going to be able to read the chat, but I'm just going to put out there as a general question. If you all want to type in, there'll be a log of this that I can take a look at later. I'm curious how many of you are actually commercially oriented producers of herbs right now, whether they're forest, native botanicals, or some type of other herb. So by commercial, I mean, are you growing something that you are selling as a crop, whatever quantity that might be? And so if you consider yourself a grower that is selling, be curious to know what it is, and just kind of log that in on the lower left-hand side if you don't mind. I know some of this information will be sensitive, but only your name appears. So with that said, I'm going to jump into the content, and we're going to start out by talking about this idea of agroforestry. I don't know how many of you have been tuning into this entire series, but this is a theme that has come up over and over again. And really what I'm going to be focused on here is this idea that we can actually not only make money off of growing these plants, but we can conserve these plants, and I'm going to be focused on native medicinal plants, by growing them, and specifically by growing them in the forest. So here we're talking about plants that are native to the eastern forests. Again, for those in the western U.S., there are a variety of different plants you may be aware of that grow in the forest there. But we're going to be talking about the idea that you can grow these forest plants not necessarily out of their home, in other words, in artificial shade-covered fields, but rather let's use the forest, their native habitat, to produce a high-quality product. In doing so, there's a variety of different benefits that we might achieve, okay, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Within the United States, we do have a USDA National Agroforestry Center. If you Google that, if you're not familiar with it, you'll find that that's a great resource. It exists. A lot of people don't realize that the USDA does have their hand in promoting agroforestry here in the United States. So you definitely want to connect with them and that effort. And they recognize 5 different practices within the agroforestry scheme, if you will, in the United States. And the one we're going to focus on today is known as forest farming. There is no really well-established definition of forest farming. And so this one is kind of an amalgamation of things that I kind of like based on my own experience and some of the academic materials that are out there. But basically we're talking about an agroforestry practice in which specialty crops are either introduced or they're already existing and they're husbanded in the forest. And that forest, in turn, is managed to provide conducive growing conditions through forest stand improvements. Okay, now that's a lot to keep in mind, but it also encapsulates the idea that there is really no cookie-cutter mold here for me to stand here and or sit here and preach to you all. It depends on what crops you're interested in or have present on your forest lands, what type of forest lands you have, their condition, whether you're trying to manage for overstory productivity, such as certain timber species, or other non-timber forest products like maple syrup, or if you're strictly focused on a particular medicinal plant and that's all you're interested in. And so there's a variety of different ways that we can talk about this, including introducing plants that are not there, such as ginseng, and growing them as a crop, or finding ginseng on your property and encouraging that ginseng to grow and be fruitful and develop essentially a crop from it. Okay? And I would say these days, come back to the reasons as we go through, these days it's very easy to get your eyes and your goals set on introducing a variety of different plants on forest lands and growing them. But what I hope to attune you to at least a little bit in this presentation is that the way to approach it really is to get to know your forest lands, find out what's growing there, find out what likes to grow there, and don't fight it. work with that ecosystem to grow whatever plants it wants to grow in abundance. That said, there are many plants like American ginseng that have been over-harvested throughout the 300 years of exploitation, and they're just not going to be found on your forest land, even though it may be conducive to growing there. So sometimes, a lot of the time, there is a little bit of trial and error that also has to take place. But certainly, you have to start with getting to know the forest lands that you want to produce on. Now, why might we focus on growing on forest lands? There's a variety of different benefits, but I'll just say from the purposes of these particular botanicals that I'm going to focus on, and again, I'll talk about 3 out of perhaps as many as 50 native forest botanicals that grow on eastern forest lands, east of the Mississippi, and a little bit west of Mississippi in some cases, that have commercial market value and have at least somewhat of a deep market demand at this point. So we're specifically focusing on these things that grow on forest lands. As a result, many of them, not all of them, but many of them have the very simple requirement that they are shade obligate, which means that they require shade in order to complete their life cycle and grow over time. They will tolerate some disturbance and some full sunlight for some part of the growing season, but they will not tolerate it indefinitely. Okay, so in that regard, what we have to think about is one of the best and most obvious benefits from growing the plants on forest lands is that we are utilizing the existing forest canopy to provide that shade. And that's not an insignificant expense. When we look at the cost of shade production, whether it's in Wisconsin or places like Ontario, it's a significant expense. We're talking about estimates somewhere between $15,000 to $35,000 an acre, depending on how new the materials are and whether you're working in cooperative fashion and what kind of equipment you have to purchase versus rent versus borrow, all those sorts of things. But the shade alone, in many cases, can cost upwards of $15,000 to $35,000. So it is a significant expense. It's one that has to be borne over a period of years. As we'll talk about, these plants do not grow in a single growing season. They have to be grown for many years. And as a result, that is a huge expense to think about. So one of the biggest benefits to growing in the forest through an agroforestry-based forest farming system is simply to reduce the cost associated with that canopy or that shade. Okay, other benefits that we could think about very quickly is, of course, income. And I'm going to just put it out there that while there may be many of you, most of you, it's hard to tell, who are tuned into this presentation, who are just interested or maybe interested in growing a little bit of these plants on your own property for your own use or for small local markets, I'm going to focus on the bigger picture. That is, what if you are interested to do this as a significant source of income? Okay, not just as a hobby, but as a source of income. And so in that regard, many of these plants do offer that opportunity. Okay, and that's why we're talking about them. These are not plants that are going to be something that you can just harvest and use to make your own ointments or your own salves, but rather something that you can actually sell into the existing commercial trade markets. And so income is certainly an advantage to growing these plants. Stewardship of forest lands is something that we talk about from the extension side of things, but it's also a tool that helps landowners. So in other words, if you can gain income, and relatively speaking, it's shorter-term income from growing these plants on forest land, that is a way to accomplish other objectives on that forest land, whether it's timber management or deer fencing or basic plant control. That income can help offset some of the costs associated with whatever it is that you want to do on those forest lands, whether it's restoration or improvement or further income generation, or just paying for it, offsetting the cost of the land and the taxes and so on. So stewardship value. And then finally, in the state of Pennsylvania, I'm going to come at you directly from Pennsylvania because that's where I'm working, but it, again, has broader applicability. We're dealing with a lot of forest fragmentation issues. And so, in short, what that means is a lot of our forest lands are getting either converted or they're becoming parcelized into smaller and smaller parcels, which lead to other issues associated with management and invasive species spread and so on. And so growing a lot of these plants in the understory of a forest can provide a mechanism and a means of income and a means of stewardship for keeping that forest intact and basically doing your part in conserving forest lands here in the eastern U.S. So there's a variety of things that come from growing these plants on forest lands as opposed to agronomic fields with shade over top of them. Just hitting a few highlights. I'm sure you all have some of your own thoughts about what you might hope to get from it. Okay. Now, the first thing I want to introduce is a lot of the economics that I'm going to touch on here. I am going to have some economic dense slides, but I'll try and just hit the highlights. If you want to dig into the details, this paper will be circulated after this presentation. You're welcome to look into the financial models and some of the details about how we calculated some of this profitability or lack thereof for some of these botanicals. Okay, and I just want to point out that some of the models then come from this paper, which was published in the Journal of Agroforestry Systems a few years ago. And it was a paper that I published with co-author Mike Jacobson, who's a forest economist here at Penn State University. And basically what we tried to do in this paper was take as a given that there was interest and there is a need for people to grow many of these plants on forest lands, and let's work with some growers and with some growing trials and some data collected from growing trials and put together some financial models for what this looks like. That is, if you are going to adopt agroforestry-based production on forest lands for a variety of different plants, can you make money at it, bottom line? So I'll share more of that as we move along. Okay. Now, I'm going to use 3 case studies to illustrate some of the reasons why we have opportunities to grow these plants and some of the reasons why we have challenges to grow these plants, and also to underscore the need to grow these plants. And that's a given. And so at the end, I'm going to wrap up with some kind of looking ahead at where we're at with some of these markets and the market demand and what needs to happen. And again, I would encourage some of you, particularly if you're commercially oriented and growing some of these botanicals or interested in it, feel free to get in touch with me afterwards, and I can basically bring you into the fold with some of the supply chain stuff we're working on right now. But the 3 case studies that I'm going to talk about are black cohosh, Apia racemosa, also known as Timothy racemosa, golden seal, Hydrastis canadensis, and American ginseng panax quinquefolius. These are 3 out of perhaps as many as 50 plants that grow on eastern forest land that have a significant market demand and should be grown, or at least there is strong interest in growing them. And we're going to use them to illustrate various reasons why we want to grow them, what the opportunities are, and what the challenges are. Okay, for those who are not aware of these plants, or for those who are tuning in from other parts of the United States and just don't have these in their backyard, that sort of stuff, I'll just hit a few highlights about each of the plants and give you some pretty pictures to look at, if nothing else, so that you can get a sense of what these plants look like. And black cohosh is a native forest plant in the eastern U.S., found from southern Canada all the way down to northern Florida, a little more abundant in the core part of its range, which is essentially Pennsylvania down to the Carolinas. It has an extremely strong market demand. I'll look at this data here. I'll put this up. This is from the American Herbal Products Association, which has been doing a formal survey of its members over the years. They have a more recent survey that has come out. I have not included that in this table, but this gives you some sense of the volume of this particular commodity. We'll come back to some of these others as we move through this. And this is from 1997 to 2005. This is not a full market census of everybody that's growing, selling, buying, trading black cohosh and these other botanicals in the United States. This is just what was reported during this time period. And I highlight this to point out the fact that even with a minimum estimate of what was gathered by the American Herbal Products Association alone from its memberships, basically we have in any given year from 118,000 to about 750,000 pounds of dry product of black cohosh moving through the marketplace in any given year. That's a tremendous amount of product, especially considering that it is estimated, nobody knows for certain, for a variety of reasons, but it's estimated that fully 97 to 99% of that material or greater is wildcrafted, meaning it's harvested from the wild. So, there's a conservation concern, and hence the cultivation through conservation, or conservation through cultivation, but there's also an opportunity, right? There's an opportunity for people to step in and say, you know what, I can grow this stuff. It grows well on my forest land, and I'd be happy to grow this for market. And so what we want to do here is walk through some of the nuts and bolts of black cohosh market and production. Okay, the price is another matter altogether. So I've worked with some folks over the years, including someone that's on this webinar. I see Steve Turchak. I'll just give a shout out to him. Thanks, Steve, for a lot of the price data. But worked also with some of the regional consolidators to pull together some of the price data, particularly in recent years, and pull together kind of a composite of what's going on with the black cohosh markets. So what you can see overall is a trend upwards. This is not adjusted for inflation. For anybody that's really into the nuts and bolts of economics, just say this is not adjusted for inflation. So this is just real-time price data, if you will, from 1968 onwards to 2012. What you can see is the price has gone up, okay, but we still are hovering somewhere between $3 and $5 a pound typically in recent years. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about whether that's a good price or not, because some of you are probably scratching your head saying, well, what does that mean? Okay, so what does that mean? So I'm going to refer to the paper, and I'm going to explain, since this is the first time I'm putting this particular graph up, and I'll show it for Golden Seal and American Ginseng next, okay, but this is a histogram. This is kind of an easy way to visualize what we report in the paper, and basically this summarizes a lot of what we found in working with growers, in working with yield data and growing trials to figure out what was the yield and how much money could you make and so on. And so let me just summarize what's going on here. So what we did in that paper is for a quarter of an acre, we identified how much black cohosh you could get, right? So what your yields would be, what the average root weights would be, what the prices were, what the price was between 1990 and 2005. We did adjust that for inflation, and that's what you're seeing over on the left side of this histogram, the historic prices. These are the prices between 1990 and 2005, and it has since jumped up to about $5 a pound, okay, which, as you'll see in a moment, doesn't really matter too much. During that time, when you adjust for inflation, the minimum price that was paid was about $1 a pound. Maximum price about $3 a pound, on average about $2 a pound. Then what we did is work with growers to identify if we were going to grow this in the forest, not just wildcraft it, but we were going to make some beds. We were going to grow this stuff, plant the seed, and through a variety of different kinds of husbandry mechanisms, come back in a few years and then harvest it. So what we have is seed versus transplant. Seed in the green bars, transplant in the yellow bars. Underneath that, then, we've got a bunch of short little acronyms. EH means early harvest. Okay, 6 year means 6 years. So if we were to grow black cohosh out from seed, generally it's accepted that you need about 6 years at least in forest land conditions to get a yield, a commercially viable yield of black cohosh root. But there is some sense that under the right conditions, if you push those plants, you might be able to get commercially harvestable roots at 4 years. And this is all data that just wasn't picked out of the sky. This was pulled out from experts like Janine Davis, from growers operating throughout the eastern U.S., and from growing trials that have been conducted in Ohio and elsewhere. And so we've got anywhere from a 4 to 6 year time horizon to which we can harvest this stuff. Now, NSC means what if we didn't have to buy that planting stock? What if we had black cohosh on our property? We could divide the roots and we could grow it from seed. Okay? NAC means what if we didn't have any annual costs associated with it? That is, we planted the plant in year 1, we went back and harvested in year 6. We didn't do anything in between. And then the EH, NSC, and NAC is simply the most parsimonious model. That is, what if we could get an early harvest? What if we didn't have any stock costs? And what if we didn't have any annual costs? And we calculated from seed and transplants what those break-even prices would be for black cohosh. So what you're seeing there at the top of those histograms is the cost that you would need to get to recover, or the price you would need to get to recover the cost of that production according to each of those methods. So in other words, if you were to grow black cohosh from seed, okay, and do it in 6 years, investing a certain amount of labor and stock costs, you would need about $77 a pound to break even. That does not include profit, $77. Okay, if you were able to push that black cohosh, you didn't have to pay for the stock, and you didn't have any annual costs, you could get that down to somewhere around $25 a pound. Okay, that would be your break-even costs. Now, if you look over at the left at the historic prices as to what the wholesale market has been paying, in recent years, it doesn't take a whole lot of math skills or anything of that nature to realize that you would be operating within a deficit, right? You would not be able to make much money at all. In fact, you would be losing money in most of the, if not all of those scenarios. And that assumes that you are selling into the wholesale markets that exist, the markets that I just talked about that buy up to 750,000 pounds of ginseng or black cohosh each year. Okay, this does not include those retail markets or direct-to-consumer markets that you might develop on your own, all right? But it does point to the fact that those break-even prices are nonetheless true for everyone. So if you are an existing black cohosh producer, you haven't sat down and done the math, I would encourage you to do the math in terms of how much it costs you to produce a pound of black cohosh. Because a lot of people don't do this. They don't do it for tomatoes. They're sure not going to do it for black cohosh. But to map out what it is that your investment is and what you need to get to make money off of it, or at least break even, is an important activity to adopt any crop. And certainly with these botanicals, because they are new crops and the economics and the marketplace financing has not been worked out, it's very important to do this sort of thing. So whether or not our models are 100% accurate, you can decide. I would encourage you to look at the paper, and again, you can approach me, particularly if you're a producer and you've got different models to share with me. I'm happy to kind of revise and share that information with people. But what we found, at least from modeling and then taking this information out and sharing it with other growers and other producers, is it seems to be that we're at least somewhere in the ballpark, whether you give or take a few dollars, somewhere in the ballpark in terms of cost of production and what the market has been willing to pay. And so the bad news is, and I hate to hit you over the head right out of the gate here, because I've kind of been working you up to, well, there's some opportunity here, right? Well, out of the gate, I'm going to tell you that although there's opportunity, the challenge here is that, at least with black cohosh, and it is true for a variety of other botanicals as well, the market is not willing to pay the true cost of production for this plant. And there's a lot of reasons that this is true, and I'd be glad to talk about this at the end, but nonetheless, this is where we're at. And so it's something to consider in the adoption of this particular crop. So I'm going to let this alone for a moment and move forward, and we'll compare this economic modeling with some of the other crops I'll talk about, and then we'll kind of wrap it up and talk about how we can resolve this situation, if you will. Okay, so I'm not looking at the chat because I'm trying to stay focused, but if nobody has posted this already, some folks might be saying, well, what's black cohosh good for? I'll just say very quickly, this is not how to use kind of webinar or anything of that nature, so we're just going to hit the highlights. Of course, you can find this information on your own if you're not familiar with what it's good for. But black cohosh is one of the most in-demand forest botanicals. It is used these days for the treatment of menopausal symptoms associated, like hot flashes and cramps and irregular menstruation for those who are just approaching menopause, that sort of stuff. So it's considered, quote unquote, a women's medicine. There are patented forms of this that are available, including remifemin that are on the market, and there are a variety of different kinds of tinctures and capsules and standardized extracts and so on that are also on the marketplace. Very popular and arguably clinically effective remedy for women's troubles. Historically also used for rheumatism, by the way. Okay. Black cohosh has a very, we'll just say, inconspicuous appearance vegetatively. I mean, once you get to recognize it, it's something that does stand out, but it's not something that really jumps out at you. It sits in the understory of the forest, oftentimes for many, many years without going through production, no flowering, no fruiting, nothing of that nature. So this is what it looks like growing there. Okay. Now, this is where we get into some of the issues that agroforestry-based production that it can hopefully address. And so we're going to take a little bit of detour as we talk through some of these botanicals and talk about some of the reasons why we want to grow these in addition to the market demand. So let me just put up what we call dichotomous key in botany, if you're not familiar with this. Okay, this is a way that we can sort through unknown plants. We're out in the field and we're trying to figure out what a plant is. And I'm putting this up. This is from the Plants of Pennsylvania, 2007, because this is the key to the 4 Actaea species that occur in Pennsylvania. Now, throughout the eastern U.S., there are, I believe, about 9 different species of Actaea. I might be off by 1 or 2 species based on most recent taxonomic treatments, but there are more than just one. That's the bottom line. More than Actaea racemosa in the eastern U.S. Okay, and vegetatively, they are quite similar to one another. And so when you look at dichotomous keys, you're going to see that they don't use the vegetative features to identify differences between the species, generally speaking. Okay? Instead, they rely on reproductive characteristics. And so I'll just try not to bog you down if you're not botanically inclined in the terminology. It's not important what I put up on the screen here for you to understand what a follicle versus a berry is. For those who do understand that term, great. But what I want to point out is the fact that when you're trying to distinguish between something like black cohosh, Actaea racemosa up at the very top, and something like Actaea podocarpa right below it, you'll notice that all of a sudden we get into some very tricky taxonomy, especially if you're not a botanist. We get into distinguishing between the number of carpels present in a flower. And at this point, if I had you all in the room, I would say, okay, who could tell me what a carpel is? And we'd go through a botany lesson. But I'll just spare you that, and I'll say the carpel is the reproductive structure, the female portion of the flower. Okay? So we're counting the number of ovaries, if you will, that exist per flower. And we're also looking then at the fruit and how thick the wall is of that fruit. Okay? So that's a rather technical detail. And I guess I would submit to you at this point, how many of you do you think that are out there wildcrafting this material over 750,000 pounds per year, are out there counting the number of ovaries whenever they're out there digging the black cohosh roots? Okay, much less the fact that many of the plants are not going to be in reproductive stage. They're going to be a vegetative stage, and so there's no way to count them. So we quickly get into this notion that we've got more than one species of plant, and that these plants can be confused or mixed up with one another. Okay, and so let me just show you what this looks like for those of you who are saying, okay, get to the bottom line here, Eric. If we were to go out and look at black cohosh in flower, and let me see if I can pull up my handy pointer, okay, you would notice that right here, pointer, there we go. Right here is the ovary in the center part of that flower. So black cohosh doesn't have any petals. It has a few sepals that fall off early in the flower opening, but it's primarily a flower that's composed of male stamens that are on the outside and then an ovary that sits on the inside. So this is black cohosh. It usually has 1 ovary and occasionally may have 2 ovaries per flower. Okay? So that when this flower starts to turn into a fruit, you'll notice we start to have single follicles, these dry fruit that start to mature over the course of the growing season. Now, black cohosh flowers during the month of July, typically, at least here in the mid-Atlantic region, maybe a little bit earlier, the southern part of the range a little bit later, the northern part of its range. Okay, and, oops, get off this pointer. Okay, and then as those fruits start to develop, we start to see that per pedestal, that is this little fruiting stalk, we get one individual fruit that's developing. Get the idea. And then that fruit starts to mature, we get the seeds, and so we have this cluster of follicles, okay, that are present during the winter months. And in fact, those of you who know black cohosh can go out on forestlands right now and find the tops from this past year, okay, and you often find seeds still in them. And because if they shake in the wind, they tend to make a noise. It sounds like a rattle. A lot of people call this rattle or rattle top. Okay. So let's compare that with the other Actaea, Podocarpa. So as you're looking at this flower, you see how similar they are in bloom. Okay. Now, can anybody point out the number of ovaries? It can get very tricky, right? So now we're looking at this flower, and they're kind of buried in there. But if I put the little pointers on there, now you can see that there are 3 ovaries, right, rather than 1 in that particular flower. Boy, that's a technical detail, right? Really technical. Okay. Now it gets a little bit easier as these flowers start to develop, and we get multiple ovaries developing in the flowers, and you can see that it looks a little bit different than black cohosh, or a lot different, depending on your skills. And then we see that the fruits start to develop in clusters rather than single portions. Okay. And then as they dry, you can see that we've got multiple follicles rather than just a single one. Okay, so in fruit, maybe not so difficult once you get an eye for it and you're trained to recognize the difference between the 2 different species. In flower, a little bit more difficult. Vegetatively, let me show you what it looks like. Here is American buckbane. So I don't think I need to even flip back to that earlier slide for you to look at that and realize that it's almost impossible. Some people say impossible. I'm pretty much in that camp to tell the difference between American buckbane and black cohosh based on the vegetative characteristics alone. In other words, if you're walking through the understood forest and you're looking at these tops without any reproductive structures on it, it's virtually impossible to know with 100% assurances what you're looking at. Okay, and so we quickly get into a slippery slope of identity, right? Are we actually harvesting the right plants? Okay, and let's talk a little bit about why that's important. So let's talk about Pennsylvania, the fact that American buckbane is at the northern end of its range. All of these little dots that I'm putting at are known locations for this plant. And you'll see that, at least in Pennsylvania, it occurs in about a 6-county area down in the southwestern portion of the state. It often mixes in with black cohosh on the same site within feet of one another. Okay, so it's not easy or as easy as just saying, well, this particular forest land has black cohosh and this particular forest land has American buckbane. No. They actually grow together on many sites. And so as we're harvesting, we may think that we know what we're harvesting, but we may be mistaken. And in the case of American buckbane in Pennsylvania, at least, this is a threatened species. So we've got this conservation issue to contend with. Okay. Let's talk about another reason. When we take that root out of the ground, and it is the root that's used in black cohosh, you may notice this slide, the root is a little bit lighter in color than the black cohosh. Okay, that's true, but as the roots are dried, that difference goes away, and it is virtually indistinguishable. And so the roots can become intermixed with one another, and so we can have American buckbane being mixed in with black cohosh. Okay, and so the natural question is, does it matter, aside from a conservation standpoint? Well, there's some work. Went too far ahead. Let me back up. There's some work that's been going on in recent years. This is from 2008, where people are trying to get at that very issue, and they're trying to figure out, is there adulteration happening in this market? And there's a really good review of this, by the way, that was published recently, written by Stephen Foster, I believe, in Herbalgram. And I'd be glad, again, to send that link around if people are really interested in getting into the meat of this stuff. Contact me afterwards. The bottom line is Actaea is well known for having adulteration going on in the marketplace. In some cases, it's Actaea from other continents. This genus does occur in both Europe and China, and that material can be cheaper. And depending on who it is that's a manufacturer, they may or may not be buying that material from elsewhere and selling it as black cohosh. And some of you may be disturbed by that, but that's the reality of the supply chain right now. Okay? And so we do have this adulteration going on. And then when we get specifically to this case of Actaea podocarpa, the recent research, and this is in 2007, so this has been known for about 7 years now, points to the fact that there are distinctive chemicals, and in this case they've named them podocarpicides, that are found in Actaea podocarpa that don't appear to be found in black cohosh. So in other words, there are different molecules, there are different chemistries associated with these two plants. And if we back out and look at the bigger genus, one could postulate, and this has not been fully vetted or investigated to my knowledge, one could postulate that there's all kinds of variation going on in this genus. And so this substitution of one plant for another, whether it's intentional or inadvertent, is quite frankly unacceptable, particularly in the 21st century herbal marketplace. Okay? And so why might we want to grow black cohosh? Well, because we can assure not only we've got sustainable supply chain, but because we know what we're getting. And increasingly, the buyer wants to know what they're getting, and the buyer will consider the consumer, yes, but we'll also consider the companies. Okay? Companies want to know what they're getting because this is becoming recognized as an issue. This idea that we can go out and dig black cohosh, mix it inadvertently together, and put it on the supply chain, and then see what happens. So we need to get this supply chain into the 21st century. And some of you may be shocked to know that many of these botanicals are not vetted in terms of their identity. And that's a real problem. And I'm a big advocate, proponent of using herbs, and I find it to be a problem. Okay? If we want to make sure that consumers of herbal products are safely using correct herbs at correct dosages, we have to start with the correct plant. So this is unacceptable, and yet here we are in 2015, okay, still depending on wildcrafted material, which may or may not be accurately identified. Okay. So moving forward, are people growing black cohosh? Well, this is a shade garden from Ontario. Okay, there's a fellow up there by the name of John Kershaw, and I'll show you a picture of him in a moment. But I saw some folks tuning in from Ontario, Canada. I'm wondering if they're associated with any of these growers. But essentially, the folks that grow ginseng and some other herbs up there have been playing around with this crop for a few years now. These are some slides I took when I visited John a few years ago. And looking at how quickly you can grow black cohosh, what the yields look like, what the economics look like, and so on. And what they're finding is that you can get a harvest in, like I said, about 4 years. That may be 3 years as far as I know right now, but we're still looking at about a 4-year time run. So you can push the plants a little bit, and you can see that they do grow quite well under artificial shade. Okay. And this is John growing in a crop of 3-year-old plants. Okay, so you can see that they're reproducing already at 3 years in a forested environment. Sometimes it'll take 5, 6, or more years before they start to produce flowering tops. Sometimes much longer than that. Okay? And so the plants do respond very well to this idea of horticulture, right? Of taking the plants out of the forest, putting raised beds, irrigating them, fertilizing them, and so on. The bottom line, though, with this type of production is we still have to cover the cost of all that artificial shade that you see above John's head, as well as all that mechanized production. Okay? And my last conversations with John, and I think that this is borne out to be true, is that the economics on this, in this type of intensive production, even though the yields were up and the quality of the plants was improved, that the economics just did not work out. And so there's very little of this type of production happening. So there's been dabbling, in other words, with trying to get black cohosh under artificial shade, just like we grow some of the other plants like ginseng. But a lot of people have backed away from it simply on account of the economics, not really working out to be as favorable as you might hope. So we run into this problem of cultivation under artificial shade actually panning out. Okay? And here's some plants here, different ages growing under this artificial shade environment. Okay? So you might ask yourself then, and there's me in case you're wondering what I look like. That was me a while ago. But that was a black cohosh plant that I dug out of some trials I had going under some trees. And basically I put this slide up because people have been playing around with these yield estimates and trying to figure out, well, what if we push these plants and we get these higher yields? Can't we change the economics? Can't we turn it on end? And all of a sudden, because our yields are better, we're making more money, or at least we can get by with less price because we're not putting as many plants into a pound, if you will. And so we included that in this paper. And again, I would ask you to look at the paper for details. I'm just going to hit the highlights here and talk to me afterwards. But what we found out is that we calculated the amount of increase above our yield that we got in our models. So in other words, what we use to calculate our pricing and our yields, that sort of stuff in the models, we calculated how much you would need to increase those yields to break even. Okay, and that's using a discount rate of 4%. I didn't talk about that at all yet, but for those who know economics, basically that means you have to wait some amount of years to get a return off your investment, right? And so 4% is a really low rate of investment return. And so we used a really minimal kind of rate. And set that aside for the moment. Just look at these yields. And what you'll see is that when you look at something like black cohosh, at that minimum price that we found from 1990 to 2005, remember that was about $1, you would need about 71 times the yield increase as to what we used in these models in order to break even, not just to make money from seed, okay, and 64 times from transplant. And if you look at the maximum price of $3, it's about 24 times. Now, in other words, if you were to grow this stuff and you were to say, okay, I'm going to push these plants, I'm going to get a greater yield, each root is going to weigh a pound or what have you, this is what you would come up with. You would need 24 times the amount of yield than what we included in this model to actually come up with a break-even price. Okay? And so hopefully that makes sense to you. If not, take a look at the paper, and again, you can follow up with me. But bottom line is that's unrealistic, folks. That's unrealistic. When we look at something like golden seal, I'm going to turn my attention to golden seal in a moment. You can see that 2 or 3 times the yield. Yeah, we can achieve that. We can push those plants and we can double the yield. Okay, but when we start looking at black cohosh or look at blue cohosh, 396 times the yield used in those models, we're just way out of the league here, okay? And finally, we're going to end up with American ginseng here, and you'll notice there is no increase needed in the current American ginseng market. Everybody can make money at American ginseng, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. Okay, so, yeah, you can increase yields, but in most cases, in these models that we develop, the yields would have to improve by such a factor that it's unrealistic for many of these botanicals. So I just want you to think about that as you think about, okay, well, what if I were to use Miracle Grow on my plants? Not that I'm advocating that. Yeah, you can increase the yields perhaps, but that's not going to solve the problem with many of these plants. Okay, so we're going to move on to golden seal, okay? And I realize we're almost an hour, but we're going to move fairly quickly now because I've kind of introduced all the baseline information that we need to kind of orient you. And the main thing I want to recap here is that economics are challenging for many of these forest botanicals, even though we've got a deep demand and even though we've got issues with identity and quality. Okay, so now let's talk about golden seal. Okay, golden seal is also found throughout the eastern U.S., okay, from about Ontario to about northern Florida or thereabouts. Native forest plant, blooms very early in the spring, found in the buttercup family, as with black cohosh, stamens that are attractive. The amount of golden seal that moves through the marketplace is significant. It can be as much as 265,000 pounds. Again, these are minimal amounts that have been reported. There is some amount of that is being cultivated. Just we don't know how much, but some percentage of that, maybe 10 to 15%, is estimated. Okay, the prices are born on the root and the top. So the herb, that is the tops, can be sustainably harvested at the end of the season, and those can be sold. You can see those fetch somewhere between $1 and maybe $12 a pound. Recent years, about $5 a pound. Okay, the roots themselves, now we're looking a little bit better. Instead of $1 to $3 a pound, we're somewhere up around, say, $20 to $35 a pound in recent years. Okay, so the prices are jumping a little bit. But when we look at, again, the same model, okay, we look at the historic prices adjusted for inflation. This is 1990, 2005. We find $18 minimum, $39 max, about $45 on the average. Production from seed and from transplants oftentimes can be unprofitable. The exceptions are, if you look on the right-hand end of those histograms from both seed and transplants, you'll see that if we are able to grow the plants without investing a whole lot in the stock costs and without investing a whole lot in the annual costs, okay, and we can push those plants to some degree, okay, to get them harvestable in, say, 4 years again, we can end up with break-even costs somewhere around $25 again. And you can see that the prices in some years have been as much as $40. So now all of a sudden we're making maybe as much as $15 a pound off of our harvest. Okay? And moreover, these days, some of the companies are contracting directly with the growers to grow organic certified golden seal, and they're paying a premium, maybe up to $45 or $50 a pound. So the economics are looking a little bit better for golden seal. But here, I just want to point out the fact that you do have to jump in doing some homework. And you have to know when to sell, and you have to know who to sell to. You can't think that just because you put golden seal in the ground, you're somehow going to make money because someone paid $40 10 years ago. You got to think about who you're going to sell to, what they're going to pay, how much they're going to buy from you, and how much you can bear in terms of your cost of production. So these things need to be thought about before you jump in. Okay. Golden seal, in short, although they're all over the place, I've got some herbalists out there trying not to be offended by what I'm about to say, but in general, golden seal is considered to be an herbal antibiotic. Okay, that is that at least topically, it does have a very broad kind of antimicrobial, antifungal application. That doesn't hold true when it's consumed internally, so there's a lot of contention in the herbal practitioner world about whether you should actually use it for things like colds and infections and that sort of stuff internally rather than externally. But nonetheless, it is a very potent herb. It has three main constituents, and I'll come back to these in a moment, that are documented to be therapeutically useful, and that's berberine, hydrasine, and cannadine. Okay. Some people are growing golden seal already, and they are making some money, but again, you have to be very savvy about who you're selling to when you're harvesting and that sort of stuff. Here's Larry Harding down in Friendswood, Maryland. He's growing organic certified golden seal, and certainly it's not his main crop, but it's something that he diversifies his ginseng operation with. Okay. And here's typically what a wild patch of golden seal looks like coming up in springtime, and you might say, well, what are you talking about? Talking about this little green area between the arrows. Okay, this is a patch that I do a lot of research on here in central Pennsylvania, develop yield models and so on. I'm going to share more about this patch in a moment with you. And it's a colonial species, so it often, once it's established in an area, if it's growing well and it likes to grow there, it often grows on its own and spreads on its own. And it can be difficult to get rid of in the end. Every little piece of the fiber from that root, rhizome, that's left behind in the soil is capable of regenerating a new top. So it's a much easier plant to grow than black cohosh or ginseng, provided that it has ideal growing conditions. Okay? And also you'll notice growing in with this are black cohosh. So oftentimes they grow on the same site, so we can develop what we would call polyculture rather than a monoculture. We can grow a lot of these botanicals side by side in the understory of the forest and diversify what we're doing. Now, the case digression that I want to make on golden seal here briefly is Economically, there is some case to be made for growing this plant, and so we get into some of the issues about sustainability, of course, and we also get into this issue of quality, and quality is the thing that I want to hammer on in the next minute or two. At particular locations here in central Pennsylvania, I've got some patches of golden seal that I've been harvesting from a number of years. A few years ago, I got a small grant to do a harvest study and look at the timing of harvest and what the influence was on the chemistry of the plants. That is, if you were to harvest in midsummer versus early fall, was there a difference in the berberine content? In addition to that, we looked at it over 3 different populations, okay? And so there's a third population that's not indicated here. I just indicated it with my arrow. So what we did is follow this little hollow. There's a drainage, and there's 3 different clones of golden seal on this site. Okay, remember this is a clonal plant. So we harvested from each of the clones, spatially separated, okay, on different dates, and had them chemically analyzed to see what the berberine, hydrasine, and cannadine content was. Okay, so we started with fruit production in midsummer. This is about July 2nd or 3rd, and there's the fruit on golden seal. It's often referred to as a berry, okay, although it's a fleshy set of achenes, technically. Okay, and there's Steve. He's out there harvesting, and we went all the way up to senescence. And by senescence, I mean this is when the plants are still visible, but they're dying back, yellow, okay? So, kept all of those plants separated from each of those harvest dates, replicated within each clone on each date, harvesting 3 different groups of plants. So in other words, you have 1 clone on each date, taking a sample 3 different times on each date from each clone, okay, and then doing that over the course of the season. And this is what it looks like then. Harvested on July 2nd, 2012. Harvested on August 7th, 2012. Harvested on September 8th, 2012. And finally, October 12th, 2012. Okay, so from fruit production all the way up to senescence. Looked at total alkaloid content first. Okay, and we'll notice here's the 3 colonies. And what you'll notice is that total alkaloid content, generally speaking, increased. Okay, it increased with the harvest date. So as we look at each of these dates, you'll notice that the histograms tend to go up, and at the last date, October 12th, the alkaloid content was highest no matter what the colony was. Okay, but you'll also notice that colony 3 had 4.7% alkaloids versus colony 1, 4%. So there was considerable variation. Moreover, 4.7 October 12th, let's go back all the way to colony 1 and say August, and you'll see that it was all the way down at 3.7. So 1% difference in the alkaloid content. So what am I saying here? There can be a significant variation in the percent of the alkaloids present in these medicinal plants based on simply when you harvest them and which population they come from. That is, which growing conditions, which soil conditions, and so on. Okay? And so this idea of growing them in the forest through an agroforestry-based production, we can control this a lot better. We can control the harvest date, for example. We can control how we're growing it and what the growing conditions are and the clones that we're using. Okay, the genetics, in other words. When we look at berberine content, we see that the berberine content generally follows the same pattern. Okay? If we want to look at some of these other medicinal compounds, we can look at the hydrasine, we can look at the cannadine. Look at the cannadine here. Extremely different from early season to late season content of the cannadine. Hydrasine, not so much, but still different between different dates. So I just bring this up because one of the reasons we would advocate growing agroforestry-based production golden seal is because we can control the quality of the product much better. So we talked about the identity last with black cohosh. Now we talk about the quality of it. In agroforestry and forest farming of golden seal and some of these other botanicals, there's a strong case to be made for the fact that we can actually improve the quality by making sure that we're harvesting at the optimal time to get the optimal medicinal benefits from these plants. And in doing so, can't we collect some sort of premium for our effort? and make it economically viable. We're going to come back to that shortly. Okay. So I'll wrap up golden seal just to talk about the fact that there is some production still happening in golden seal, just like with black cohosh. People are trying to grow this under artificial shade. This is a shade garden from Canada once again. They're getting some yields that are pretty good, and in many cases are 2 to 3 times what we used in the models or better. You can see the plants grow very nicely up there. And a lot of these producers then are contracting directly with companies that they are doing this very detailed, quality-assured harvesting, where they're making sure to maximize the amount of bare green hydrasine candidate that's present so that these companies can meet the specific quality requirements that they need for whatever they're producing. And so there is an opportunity for growers to get into this market and get into the market for some of these botanicals based on the quality issue alone. Okay? So I know it's 3 o'clock. I hope a few of you can stick with me for another, say, 10 minutes just to round this out and talk about the case of American ginseng. Okay, so we talked about adulteration and the identity. We talked about the quality control. Now let's talk about the sustainability issue, which hits a high point when we talk about American ginseng. Okay, so American ginseng is a plant that is found throughout the eastern U.S., like black cohosh and like golden seal, often found growing on the same sites and can be used as part of an understory polyculture, like those plants. Okay. It's a plant that, until you develop an eye for it, really doesn't stick out until it has those red berries that you see on this particular picture. Has a variety of different stages of development. I'll talk about more in a moment, okay, associated with it. And it takes many years to develop a commercial root, a minimum of 5 under forested conditions, a minimum of 4, sometimes 3 under artificial shade. Okay. American ginseng, you can see this data comes to us from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which is why we've got them up here. This is a plant that's listed under the international treaty known as CITES, and we'll set that aside for the moment, but suffice it to say, out of the plants that we're talking about today, this is the most highly regulated plant. In some states, there are grower programs set up. In all states that have an export, a legal export, there are, at the minimum, wild digger programs that are set up and licensing programs that are set up. And so we have a pretty good sense of how much ginseng is actually being exported from the United States in any given year. And here you see that number, usually somewhere between 60 and 159,000 pounds. Now, the interesting thing about American ginseng is that most of the American ginseng that we're talking about growing here in forested environments ends up leaving for Hong Kong. So we're between 96 and 98% of that American ginseng. And that's because American ginseng enjoys a niche market, which many of you may be aware of, that is driven by Asian consumer demand. And I'll talk just briefly about that in the next few slides, but we'll have to let it alone for today's purposes. But just kind of take note that because of that demand and because there's not enough of this plant to go around, the prices all of a sudden, as you can see, are off the charts when we compare it to what we were looking at, especially with black cohosh. So when we were dealing with $1 to $3 for black cohosh, now we're talking about, say, $250 to $575 a pound between 1990 and 2005. Okay, and if you look at these same production models, no matter whether we're growing from seed or we're growing from transplant, you'll notice that no matter how you grow American ginseng, if you're growing it so that it looks wild or wild simulated and you can put it in the wild trade and sell it as such, you're making money. And that's the reason why American ginseng has been gaining so much interest, particularly in the last few years, amongst forest farmers as a potential understory crop, because there's no doubt that you can make money at this one as long as you can back away from the idea that you're going to grow this stuff, unlike what we were just talking about with golden seal and black cohosh, to get the biggest yield and to get the biggest plants. Instead, we're trying to grow wild-looking roots here. And if you can grow wild-looking roots, you can sell it as a wild plant, and as a wild plant, you can get these kinds of prices. Okay? And so if we break it down further, it's important to notice that the way that this market works is that rather than, say, berberine content like we were just talking about with golden seal, okay, we are talking about the appearance of the root being important here. Now, again, I don't have time to go into all of the reasons why this market exists, but suffice it to say that the bulk of the wild ginseng leaves the United States or is destined for the Chinatowns of the United States, okay, and feeds into a demand that largely originates from traditional Chinese medicine that places a premium on wild plants grown in their wild habitat in their native region of the planet. Okay? And beyond that, then, there's a whole scheme that has developed over hundreds, if not thousands of years of grading, the way that these roots are graded so that they are broken out in the trade. What I've got up here for you to see is quite simply just some very basic appearance differences. So on the right, what you can see is a cultivated root, and that's a 6-inch ruler. And you'll see that cultivated roots, because we are pushing them, generally are larger roots. They're paler in color. They've got a shorter neck, and I'm going to click on that. That is the neck. That is an underground horizontal rhizome. Anytime that the plant dies back, and it dies back every year, it leaves a scar on that neck, and those can then be used to age the plant. So when we look at the neck on a wild plant, you'll notice that it can be quite long, depending on how old the plant is. Generally speaking, the older the plant, the more it's worth. And so although we can grow ginseng in the forest and harvest it after 5 years, most growers will wait 10, 15, 20-plus years to harvest their product because they can get a greater price for that. Now, that has to be balanced against the risk of something going wrong in that 20 years. Right? Do you want to wait to get that $3,000 after 20 years, or do you want to sell it after 5 years at $500 and call it good? That's something that every producer has to decide, especially based on some of the issues like theft that we'll come back to in a moment. In the middle, we've got what's known as a woods cultivated root. This is when you amend the understory conditions such that you can push the plants a little bit. Maybe you're just going to work up the soil. Maybe you're going to make raised beds. But that's all you're going to do. You're still going to grow up the forest. And generally speaking, your neck is going to be somewhere in between a cultivated and a wild because you're going to grow it out for 5 or 10 years. And you'll notice that the roots all of a sudden now look different. They look a little bit more like a human. They've got some scars on it, those little lines, we call those stretch rings. Okay, it's got a little bit darker color. Notice, against that 6-inch ruler, the yields are going to be better, okay, on your woods cultivated than they are going to be on the wild or wild simulated. But they're both going to be less than what you would get on a cultivated plant. The prices, on the other hand, in recent years, except for the last 2 years, cultivated root has been somewhere around $5 to $30. That price has jumped in the last couple of years, up to about $70 a pound. On the other hand, your wild and wild simulated root has averaged somewhere around $225 to about $1,000 a pound or more in recent years. Okay, so we are talking about quite a difference based on where it's grown and how the product eventually looks in the end. Okay, now this is a picture from Chinatown, New York, and you can see this is cultivated root. If you're walking through, this is the kind of thing you'll see. It's all graded out. These are different grades of cultivated root. This is about $100 a pound that it's retailing for. Okay, and then if you go over to the wall, you'll notice this stuff on the glass case. Okay, and this is the stuff we're trying to grow, either for domestic Chinatown markets or for export. You'll notice all of a sudden the prices are $238. And you might say, well, you just said they were $1,000. Well, this is an ounce. Okay, this is an ounce. And the top grade stuff up here was about $550. Okay, so the prices are much different when we're talking about forest-grown American ginseng. Okay, and we're trying to replicate that wild-appearing product and grow for this niche market that is driven by Asian consumers. Okay. Because there is not enough of this plant to go around, okay, it's been exported from the United States, and we have clear records of this from states such as Pennsylvania for about 300 years. Okay, all states have these programs set up designed to help manage and conserve this plant. all states are trying to grapple with how those programs are working or lack thereof. And so one of my continued projects here in Pennsylvania, is to work with the state of Pennsylvania on figuring out what that mechanism looks like, but also working with them to figure out how they can allow for transparent development of agroforestry-based ginseng production. In other words, how do people sell into this wild market and report that they're doing such without being penalized in some way. In other words, people can be price gouged because of what they report, or if they reveal to buyers that they're growing. Sometimes those buyers will, believe it or not, send people out to poach them or feed from them. So we've got issues that we've got to sort out. Back to some of that in a moment. But all states are trying to figure out how best to manage ginseng. So if you are out there listening at this point, you're interested in growing ginseng, you've got ginseng in your property, you're interested in growing it commercially or harvesting commercially, the first thing you should do if you haven't done it already is figure out what your state ginseng program is and what the requirements are and so on. Some states have programs already set up for growers. Other states like Pennsylvania do not. Okay. As I mentioned, and I won't get into the details here, I'll point to a paper in a moment that you all can read up on this about, but ginseng is one of the most heavily regulated of the plants that we're talking about. It is one of the most heavily regulated plants in North America. It has been listed since 1975 in an international treaty, the same treaty that governs things like the trade in ivory and rhinoceros horn and all that sort of stuff. Okay, and because of that, there's this trickle down that goes through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife down to the state level, where every state that has an export program has to have a management program, a dealer licensing program. In some cases, they have digger permits and so on. And one of the things that exists right now through this trickle down effect is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who has to approve for the export of American ginseng from the United States on an annual basis, they basically have a 5-year rule, as it's called, in place. It's been in place since 1999. It changed briefly in 2006 to 10 years, but it was backed off and put back to 5 years. Basically, the intention of that, although a lot of people don't agree with it, there's some science that suggests it may not be the best mechanism, but the idea there is that with a 5-year next scar rule, you're trying to ensure that people aren't harvesting young plants from the wild. That's the intention. And whether that works or not is open to debate. But the reality is that means that as a grower, you need to have those necks on the root because the buyers want those necks intact so that they can sell those roots out of the country. Their root exports can be rejected if they are inspected and found to not have those necks on the tops of the roots. Okay. Now, the issue that we face with ginseng and the digression that I'm going to talk about, we can make money with ginseng. There is no shortage of demand. We do have some regulations to abide by, but the issue that we have with ginseng is that with all this regulation in place, with these high prices, and with this issue that we associate with sustainability, we also have what we would call the theft and the poaching element, okay? And this has only been amplified in the last year. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But this paper is going to come around. I would encourage you to look at this, and I would encourage you to think about what this means. This is just a case study of what we did here in Pennsylvania to look at, are the existing regulations working, okay? And if not, what could we do to improve them? And one of the things that came from this study was that there is tremendous support from the bottom up, right, from the grassroots up, for people to see the government invest in supporting growers and grower programs and grower markets. And that's because there is no shortage of demand. What we need are a variety of different research questions and seed supply issues resolved so that people can grow this plant to meet the demand. Okay, so there is regulation. It is more or less effective. This is one study that we did in Pennsylvania, whether it's effective. And in short, I'll just say that, people feel like, it's a good idea, but it's less effective than people actually growing this plant to meet market demand. Okay. Because it is CITES listed, we have a good sense of how much of this stuff is reported. It's not always reported, but we have is data of how much is exported on an annual basis. This is from Pennsylvania. Every state has this kind of stuff. In general, the trend is downwards. In general, we have a lot of plants being harvested. When we take the average number of roots per pound for a wild or wild simulated product, which in Pennsylvania is about 200 plants per pound, we're looking in any given year somewhere between 100,000 to as much as a million plants that they've harvested and sold into the wild trade. Okay? And if we look at other states, this is just a snapshot of what's happening in some of the other states. You can see that generally speaking, the trends are downwards. Okay? And we have, again, this notion that maybe these plants are in trouble. Okay? And maybe we need to grow more of them. Because we're just not seeing the amount that used to be there, say, in the 90s there anymore. What's the price doing? Well, that's a difficult question to answer in a quick slide, but I'm going to try and do it. The price depends on the age and the appearance of the roots, bottom line. Okay? And the age and the appearance is all over the place, depending on what you grow and where you sell it. But on average, up through 2013, we're looking at a price about $650 a pound. This past year, about last month, it was up to about $900 a pound. Okay, cultivated prices typically are down around $40 a pound, and that's up. Okay, so prices are up for both commodities. There's no shortage of demand for ginseng, and a large part of that is due to lack of supply, but also a large part of it is due to the growing Chinese economy and the ability for the Chinese consumer to pay for ginseng from North America. Most of the American ginseng is grown under these artificial shade structures in places like Ontario, Canada. A lot of these growers are very good at what they do. There's no doubt about it. The yields have been exponentially increased above what you might find in wild or wild simulated patches, but it is a very pesticide-intensive process. And for that reason, a lot of consumers, maybe some of you out there, don't like to consume cultivated American ginseng because specifically it requires lots of fungicides. And this is a problem that growers in forest lands can run into if they're not careful as well. Each one of these pallets, and this is from a warehouse, from a grower in Ontario, Canada, each one of these pallets has a different type of fungicide that is applied because very quickly, in the space of 3 or 4 years, we can get fungal resistance to these fungicides. And so we have to rotate through each of these different classes of fungicide. Does it bother you that something that you would take as an adaptogen or a tonifying plant is so pesticide intensive? It may or may not. It bothers me, and I wouldn't like to play it, frankly. But nonetheless, this is the way that the bulk of the American ginseng is grown, not only here in North America, but in China, where they are growing American ginseng as well. Okay. What we want to focus on is this forest-based production. And there are a lot of different ways to do this. Let me just introduce you very quickly to a couple of different ways, a couple of different growers who are doing this. This is growing it in the understory of the forest using woods cultivated method, thinning out a lot of the understory veg, selecting for crop trees, seeding it in, and then mulching it or letting the natural canopy leaves fall down and then growing those plants out. Okay? This is Denny on the right-hand side who is growing it like this, and this is what his crop looks like, okay, growing in the forest. Now, then you still have to use fungicide because, as you can see, those plants are literally on top of one another. So the more you push those plants like they're growing in a field, like they're a monoculture, the more you're going to run into fungus issues, and that's a major issue for growers in the forest. Okay? But he grows beautiful plants, no denying that, and those plants are typically put on the market as a wild simulated or woods cultivated product that sells into the wild market. Okay. American ginseng grows over time through a variety of different stages. It can take, as I said, 4 or 5 years to reach a minimum of 5 years or a 4-pronged stage of growth, and that's something to be cognizant about. Okay. It's not just going to be planted in the spring and harvested in the fall. Okay. And because of that, we've got all these issues to deal with, okay, as we're growing it in the forest. And so I'm going to wind this thing down by talking about what the issue is with American ginseng. We've got a market. We've got good prices. We've got a regulatory framework that largely we can work within. It's being kind of revamped in many of these states on behalf of the growers. The problem that we're running into is that many growers are becoming targets for thieves. Okay? Not poachers, but thieves, people who are intentionally seeking out the growers and going on there and stealing them. This is just one example of a letter I like to put up that I received a few years ago from one grower. This has only been heightened within the last year by shows that you may be aware of, like this one from the History Channel, Appalachian Outlaws, which is a show about, in the name of entertainment, how to steal ginseng from your neighbor. Okay? And then this one, which started airing in the fall. This is on National Geographic Channel, of all places. This is where we pit 4 teams of people against one another to see who can dig the most ginseng. Okay? And by the way, apparently ginseng is so secretive that you have to wear camouflage and carry a shotgun in order to harvest it and find it. That's a joke. Okay, and because of that, we get into situations like this. This is the case from Ohio. You'll notice the date on this, 2013, where this gentleman had been poached since 1973, 6 times. And in, I think, 2011, he ended up shooting a poacher, and that poacher died. And he was caught, and he was convicted. And unfortunately, this fellow is 78 years old, and not probably going to live the rest of his days in a happy place, and all for protecting his crop. This happens. I'm not going to say it's widespread, but it happens. And so any grower of ginseng is struggling with these issues, and I'll just have to leave it there. But bottom line is, if you are interested in growing ginseng, this is something you're going to have to consider, how to deal with theft, how to deal with poaching. You don't just put it out there on the back 40 and go back in 10 years. You've got to attend to this issue. Okay? And the other issue you have to attend to is where you're going to get the seed from. If you don't have the plants already on your property, we've got to deal with this issue. Below the beer donations can here, we see typical buyers, refrigerator, selling seed. All this seed typically comes from Wisconsin or Ontario these days. A lot of people are concerned about whether those genetics are well adapted to their forest lands or not, or what that means for the future of ginseng if we continue to harvest out all of our truly wild genetics and replace it with cultivated genetics. That's a whole big can of worms that we could sit here and talk another hour about, but it is something to think about. Where is your seed going to come from? Where is your planting stock going to come from? Because increasingly, the wild stuff is becoming scarce, and the cultivated stuff is becoming the norm. Okay? And finally, the issue that we're dealing with here is that how do you as a grower become recognized? One of the things I've been working on here in Pennsylvania is surveying, trying to figure out how many growers are out there. And what we've been finding is that when you ask people that are out there planting ginseng, here in Pennsylvania, out of 290 people that responded to a survey that we put out a few years ago, about 3/4 of them said that they were planting in small, uncrowded forest plantings. In Pennsylvania, we do not have a program that successfully differentiates those growers from the wild market. And because of that, growers face wild regulations in most states. And so this is something that you have to think about as well. What is the program in your state? As I mentioned earlier, that's something you need to do your homework about. But you also need to consider, do I have to abide by those wild regulations, or are there exemptions or programs in place for me to be able to harvest whenever I want, for example, instead of abiding by the wild harvest season, which may be September 1st. Okay? And finally, you have to figure out, what if I'm dealing with poaching issues? Who do I report to? In the state of Pennsylvania, for example, our DCNR, who has jurisdiction over ginseng in the state of Pennsylvania, they do not have enforcement authority over private lands. Instead, we have to deal with local and state police. And so as a result, our growers are often confused as to how they go about interfacing with the law enforcement community when they're having issues. And so this is all a way of saying that even with a forest farm crop like ginseng, where we have good economics, we have good supply, we have good demand, we still have issues that we need to work out with these crops. And all of these issues are often state-specific and specific to your area, whether you have a well-known theft or poaching problem that you have to contend with. Now, finally, this is my last slide for those of you who hung in there. Appreciate it. I want to talk about just briefly what's happening. to deal with all of these issues that we've been talking about, one of the things that's being piloted right now that we've been working on for the last 4 years in Pennsylvania is a new verification program. Okay, and you can think of this as a certification program like Certified Organic, but we use the term verified, and that's at the request of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service because ginseng, for example, is already certified at the state level before it's exported to the state. So it gets very confusing if we use the same lexicon. But this is set up as a third-party verification program for growers of these forest botanicals to be able to have their crop documented, to have it documented not only for purposes of posterity, but in cases of poaching or theft, to have their crop documented. In cases here in Pennsylvania, we're dealing with a natural gas drilling explosion, and we have issues with the natural gas companies want to frack on people's forest land, and they've got ginseng plantings there. It won't necessarily stop them, but they can get the value of their crop if it's recognized as a crop. But the other thing that we're piloting with this program, and we're in the first year of doing this, specifically with ginseng, but looking to expand this with some of these other botanicals, including golden seal and black cohosh next year, is that we have companies on the West Coast. Some of you may recognize Herb Farm and Mountain Rose Herbs. These companies are interested in buying from forest-based producers of these plants under this program. Because the consumers of these botanicals are increasingly becoming concerned about the issues that I've just laid out there in the last hour, okay? And because of that, we're trying to develop a quality assurance, an identity assurance, a sustainability assurance program that can be rolled out and can be recognized in the marketplace amongst consumers, and in doing so, hopefully garner a premium for people who want to grow black cohosh and be able to make some money at it. And so the companies that we're working with right now, Mountain Rose and Herb Farm, are interested in connecting with growers. And if you're a grower out there that's growing some of these plants, I would encourage you to contact me afterwards. Be glad to talk with you about this program and connecting you with those companies. Okay? Because what we're finding is that there's strong interest in consumers getting connected with this and the buyers working as the conduit for this, but we need to connect the growers up with the whole supply chain at this point. Now, this program doesn't just operate in Pennsylvania, by the way. It operates in all of the eastern states and, in fact, can operate in all of the lower 48 states. It is simply administered by Pennsylvania Certified Organic, but they're contracted with inspectors in different states to actually do the on-the-ground inspection work and keep the cost to a minimum for the actual producers. And so I'd be glad to talk with anybody further or send them links to further information about this. But it's an exciting time because as we're struggling with a lot of these issues, whether it's the economics of production or the identity or quality assurances that come from the consumers or consumer concerns, this is an exciting time because we've got programs that are now emerging. This is only one of them that are aimed to kind of fill in the gap and start to connect some of the supply chain, start to connect the growers of some of these forest botanicals with the consumers, either directly or through a variety of different middlemen or companies. And so I would encourage you not to be kind of dismayed by what I put out there, but rather to think carefully about it and do your homework and think about some of the new stuff that's coming up, like these verification programs and these marketing programs, which are seeking to connect the producers directly with the consumers, much like local vegetable farmers and flower farmers, that sort of stuff have been connected with local consumers. So with that, I appreciate you hanging in. I know I went over. It's a lot to cover, but hopefully you got something from it. And I will stick around, be happy to stick around and handle any kind of questions you might have for me immediately. I have to cough real quick, though. Okay, I'm seeing some questions that have been funneled to me for those who are hanging in there, not just because the question has been posed by you, but because you're waiting to hear what the questions might be. I don't know if you can see them, so I'm going to read them out as I answer them. The first question I see is, so when starting a forest farming, do you feel that it would be good to do natural resources assessment of one's forest to help determine the conditions and the crops that would match the conditions? That's a great question, and I would say that is absolutely the first step. So in other words, the first thing that you should do if you're interested in forest farming, we talked specifically about medicinal plants today, but we could be easily talking about mushrooms. We could be easily talking about ranch, both of which were covered as part of this series. It all comes down to getting to know your forest first and foremost. And that, unfortunately, is a big part where people turn away. And if you're one of those people who's not interested in getting out there and getting your hands dirty and getting a field guide out there and start to figure out what those darn things are that are growing out there and start to figure out, what the soil conditions are and what the different kinds of nooks and crannies that are present where you could grow ranch on one area and maybe ginseng on the other, then you really probably should bow out right now, because that's the one thing that keeps a lot of people out of this industry, is they're just looking for a cookie-cutter kind of crop, right? You just till up the ground in the springtime, you just plant the seeds, and then you harvest in the fall. We're talking about crops that have very exacting locations in some cases of where they grow. Once you find those locations, they will grow like weeds in many cases and naturalize if they're not already present in natural populations. Okay? And they take multiple years to grow. And so it becomes an exercise not only in patience, but it becomes an exercise in doing your homework and making sure that you're learning about that forested environment. But what I often say to folks is it's like a gateway drug. It's a situation where once you start to get interested in ginseng, for example, and you start to look around for that ginseng, all of a sudden you're saying, what is this? Oh, my goodness, this is blue cohosh. I wonder what this is good for. And then all of a sudden you're saying, what's this? This is wild geranium. Next thing you know, you're paying attention and learning about all that the forest has to offer, which is an amazing cornucopia of things, okay? And some of it may be just isn't that interesting, and some of it may be commercially viable. But eastern forests and western forests as well are amazing ecosystems, and you can really find that you develop not only a source of income, but really a life's pursuit, just learning about your forest lands by getting out there and getting engaged with these crops and these plants. So your first step should be doing an assessment. And each state, there's a variety of different ways you can go about that. I'll just throw out one thing really quickly, is that in most states, there are extension agencies you're probably aware of, and at least in Pennsylvania and most eastern states, as part of that extension, we have service foresters. So these are foresters that are provided by your tax dollars to forest landowners that can come out and walk through your forest lands and develop a written management plan for that forest overstory. And in some cases, I'd like to say increasingly, for the understory as well. It used to be that a lot of those foresters were only interested in the timber, but increasingly they're becoming interested in all of the forest, including the understory conditions and the products that are found there. Okay. The next question I'm seeing, how does needle cast affect these featured plants and herbs? I'm not sure what that means, needle cast. So, Jack, if you want to clarify if you're still there, I'd be glad to answer that.
I bet it means pine needles, because they're...
Pine needles, thank you. Yes. So that's part of, going back to what I just answered, that's part of learning what your forest is like. Because some plants, some botanicals, we didn't talk about any of them today, but there are botanicals that grow on forest lands that love pine forests, for example, or hemlock forests, or forests that don't have leaf litter because they are drowned by the leaf litter layer, the organic matter layer. Whereas there's other plants, like ginseng, we were talking about, which like rich deciduous forest land. So in some cases, the needles being cast, if it's a dense enough casting, all those needles falling off, they will create a mat. I know on my own property here, I've got a lot of white pine. Over years, they will build up a mat of sometimes 6 to 12 inches of nothing but pine needles. As those pine needles decompose, they tend to acidify the soil. They tend to prevent moisture from seeping through during rain events or snow events. And so you get into ultra-dry conditions. And those kinds of conditions are not conducive to things like ginseng, but they may be fine for other plants, such as partridgeberry, for example, or pink lady slipper. And so it may or may not be detrimental. It depends on which species you're interested in. Okay, so I've got Robert Van Moore says, SC, who do we contact? I'm not sure what SC means.
South Carolina.
South Carolina. Who do we contact for what purposes? I'll let you chime back in there if you're still there. It looks like you are, about contact information. Kyle, since NTFPs are so easy to steal, they're a lot like fish. There's been a lot of research done on fisheries governance that may be useful for NTFP governance. Kyle, that's an excellent point, and I avoid that kind of academic talk in a presentation like this. You already have enough to fit in. But certainly if you look at the paper that's going to be coming around about the CITES trickle-down effect, there's some case studies in there that I cite, and as part of my work, that was done as part of my PhD work, certainly got into a lot of that whole governance of the commons, if you will, how people manage resources in the commons and so on. And it's not all bad news. You know, we tend to think about if you leave people to their own will, they'll wipe it out. That's not always the case. A lot of the time people can come together and find out a perfectly sustainable, economically viable governance strategy for resources. And that is often true here in the case of non-timber forest products. You just don't hear about it a lot. But I'll just give you a really quick example of that. Here in Pennsylvania, I have dealt with growers that have come together in particular areas to keep an eye after one another's property because of the whole poaching issue. So in other words, they know when I'm going on vacation, I'm not saying me specifically, but get the idea. When I'm going on vacation, my neighbor's going to keep an eye on my property and see if sees any cars parked or someone's coming out of the woods and that sort of stuff. So there's this idea that, even in the case of poaching, that if you can work with your neighbors, if you've got trustworthy neighbors, they can actually be your eyes and ears on the ground when you can't be, and vice versa. You can be their eyes and ears. And so that's a type of governance strategy that is very easy to accomplish if you have good neighbors that you can trust. And I know a lot of the time that's an if. I don't see any other questions. So anybody else want to throw something out there, or are we done for the afternoon?
I think we're probably done. We're about 40 minutes over. But thank you all for staying,
Thanks,
and I hope you enjoyed it. And then stay tuned for next year. We'll have some more webinars lined up. I don't know yet what they're going to be. I'm going to enjoy Christmas, but then I'll figure it out. So we'll have some more good stuff for you.
Thanks, everybody.